I'm James Howell, and this is Paper Air, a retrospect on Glider. This video trilogy looks at the Glider series of video games for pre-OS X Macintosh computers. The first game appeared as a Shareware title programmed and designed by John Calhoun. Software publisher Cassidy and Green released an expanded version in 1991 titled Glider 4.0, and again in 1994 with Glider Pro. Many Macintosh gamers from that time remember the Glider games as among the most engaging, imaginative games on Mac Systems 6 and 7. It was a high point of Mac gaming, and they were formative for me, giving me hands-on experience with level design, a starting point for some technical video game literacy. Everyone who goes into games professionally has a fire pit game that kindled the imagination and made games powerful. A lot of people got that experience from Sega and Nintendo titles, but Glider was that for me. The platform that ran the games has become more niche with time. Macintosh Systems 6 and 7 are cumbersome to emulate on a modern Windows PC, so the Glider games have become obscure, and they risk being lost entirely. So, in the spirit of preserving a series of games that was important to a lot of people, these videos consider the Glider games from a number of different viewpoints, including concept inspiration, the kind of zeitgeist or context surrounding their development, and of course the games themselves. And we begin with Glider's first appearance as Shareware. Glider first appeared as a black and white arcade-style game on Macintosh Systems 6 in 1989. I'd like to present this game kind of holistically as an artifact of its time, and that requires that we look at its specific inspirations as well as the more general context that conditioned it. John Calhoun got part of his idea for Glider from programming experiments when he made ASCII versions of the arcade games Defender and Choplifter. He also drew inspiration beyond video games, specifically the behavior of styrofoam peanuts when thrown over an industrial air conditioning unit outside a mall. Calhoun built the first version of Glider on a Macintosh Plus using the programming language Pascal. He also created the bitmapped graphics using Mac Paint, a graphic program that came as a pack-in with Macs at the time. As a matter of fact, early versions of the game documented the game's technical side, so learning programmers could use the game's code in their own quest for mastery. So, pulling these different sources of inspiration together, Calhoun took the real-world concept of airlift and built a 2D obstacle course for a paper airplane. The game circulated as Shareware through his university's Mac FTP site under the label Soft Dorothy Software. This was a reference to Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz as homage to Calhoun's native state, Kansas. The final and most polished version of Shareware Glider is Glider 3+, and that number indicates the game's version rather than its place in a series. In current naming conventions, the number after a title indicates new content and design for an established fictional setting. To kind of draw that out, Super Mario Bros. 1 differs from Super Mario Bros. 3. They have different ways of meeting generally similar design goals, and they likewise interpret the same characters and landscapes with different visuals. The number after the title reflects those changes. By contrast, the number after a Shareware game on early Macs and IBM compatibles reflected degrees of refinement. Glider 3+ was Calhoun's third major revision of the game's code and design, and the number forefronted the development process. So, Gliders 1 and 2 were not games significantly distinct from 3, rather they were rougher forms of the same game that Calhoun considered finished as Glider 3+. This numbering convention actually impacted the experience of being a Shareware gamer at that time. In a way, forefronting the software version brought the player into the development process. You played the game and, by giving feedback, participated indirectly in its development. It's a relationship that current-day indie developers can maintain through outlets such as Kickstarter and Patreon. Shareware methods of payment and distribution also reinforced that sense of familiarity or participation. While a game's concept is very rarely inspired by the way it circulates, means of circulation do condition a game's scope, so it can actually reach its audience. We're going to look at that context in order to understand Glider as a shareware game of its time. For a frame of reference, we might think of shareware as a proto-indie style of making games and gaining an audience. The games were often made by one or two programmers, and the games were closely linked to the vision, personalities, and competence of specific people rather than teams. They had a kind of auteur quality. I call shareware proto-indie because contemporary indie games respond to the bottleneck of publishers that, dominate the market. In current parlance, the word indie refers to a cultural and even political division within video games, a response to the power exercised by publishers, determining which games get made, their design goals, and how those games get developed. To be sure, major software publishers existed at the time, such as Broderbund, Electronic Arts, and ICOM, and they made games considered high points of that era, such as Lode Runner, the King's Quest games, Shadowgate, Uninvited, and so on. But late 80s, early 90s, shareware programmers didn't compete with major software developers on a kind of ideological level or in frustration with AAA publisher bottlenecks. The two just coexisted. If you liked a game, the developer asked you to send cash, a check, postcard, or other payment to their address. No one had to pay for something they didn't like, so it was a low-risk way of gaming, particularly if you're a kid whose allowance couldn't stretch around a commercial game from Babbage's. In some ways, it resembled piracy or viral sharing, since you got mostly complete versions of a game for free until you decided to pay for them. However, whereas people pirate games against a publisher's wishes, shareware built itself on that casual circulation. John Calhoun stated that he only made enough money off Glider for a few pizzas when he was in college, and money wasn't his motivation in making the game, but voluntary payment is part of Glider's identity as shareware, so it's important to understand how that worked. Now we'll look at that casual circulation. Shareware worked exactly as the name states. File sharing through local BBSs, Usenet FTP, physical media, or major telecommunications services such as Prodigy, CompuServe, or the service my family used when I was a kid, America Online. There were constraints on connecting to larger services, including limits on data usage and charges for hourly access, not to mention a long-distance fee if you didn't have a number local to you. Even though players could play many shareware games entirely without cost, there was an incidental cost in acquiring the games. When you, as a gamer, are budgeting your data and time online, you don't want to risk your month's usage on something large that you weren't sure was good. Shareware games with small to moderate file sizes could get audiences more easily than very large titles. So it was a scrappy way of getting games to players without relying upon the exposure that a big publisher's game got in a storefront. The money side of shareware worked because of the software's distribution and vice versa. Everyone wants an audience even if they don't want to get paid, so these forces conditioned the kinds of games that people made. Glider's compact, focused design and its brevity worked well within these forces, making it more likely to circulate and gain the audience that loved it. So, with that context under our belts, we're ready to look at the game proper. I'm going to pause and slow down some parts of the playthrough to create time for commentary, so the game, in practice, moves more quickly than it appears here. Glider opens with soft Dorothy's splash screen of a classic nude, and its opening screen has a background image of a woman in a state of either dress or undress. This is interesting because it uses some borderline adult elements, to be sure inoffensive, in a game about something as innocent as a paper airplane. The Glider's goal as the player's protagonist is to leave the house, so the narrative theme is freedom and escape. I always like how the game takes pleasure in paper airplanes as material objects, which is highlighted by the spawning animation in the upper left. Glider introduces the player to its core mechanic at the start, using floor vents for lift to move past static obstacles. The ceiling vent in the upper left will be important later, so just mark that in your memory. Notice that I used the far right air vent to gain as much height as possible before moving to the next room. Players will lose a life at the start of the second room if they did not gain enough lift at the end of the first. The second room isn't a real challenge if players start high enough, so the game is teaching players to leave each room as high as possible. The first and second rooms also introduce players to the paper copter obstacles moving from the upper right down to the lower left. At the start of the game, the copters are mainly threats for players who take too long before deciding to act. They become problems in later rooms, though. The third room teaches two things. First, it teaches players about ceiling vents. If a glider enters a black ceiling vent, it will pop out of the last all-gray vent that it passed, in this case, the vent that I pointed out in the first room. Because these receiving vents are on the ceiling, the glider can only enter them at the top of an airlift column. Rooms 1 and 2 teach the player to use airlift to pass obstacles and start each room on a good foot, and Room 3 teaches the player about the dangers of flying too high. The third room also teaches the player to fly under obstacles, which is the second lesson here about the dangers of too much lift, depending upon circumstance. Room 4 teaches the player to combine the knowledge learned from the preceding rooms to fly between these two tables. The end of the room also requires a new skill from the player, juking the glider back and forth to use the margin of an updraft in order to get around the table edge that partially blocks airflow. Room 5 introduces the player to special objects. The score increases the faster players move through a room, and clocks add bonus time to that invisible timer. The glider entered room 6 high, but this room actually teaches about electrical outlets as static obstacles. The return vent above pushes the glider down, so had the glider entered lower than it did, it would have been pushed into the electrical outlet, which would have caught the glider on fire. Room 7 teaches the player how to navigate between two shelves vertically. It also tests the player's ability to gauge how far a glider can move horizontally from a given height, since going too high sends the glider through a receiving vent. Until now, copters have been mostly background objects, but Room 7 teaches as well that copters are serious threats when the glider needs to navigate a tight space. They create a sense of anxiety, at certain points requiring the player to get lower to the ground than they would like. Room 8 requires the player to navigate vertically down between obstacles, and it introduces candles as special objects. Candles will set the glider on fire, of course, just as electrical outlets will, but their heat also creates lift for the glider. Players can move through Room 8 in two ways. They can either use the new knowledge about candles to fly over the shelf, or they can exercise a new skill of moving vertically to grab the clock. Room 9 teaches players about folded sheets of paper as extra lives, while also requiring the player to use lessons taught in previous rooms. Room 9 gives the players two ways through. The glider can fly over all the obstacles, or it can thread the needle to get an extra life. Getting the extra life creates a kind of anxiety, because the glider must enter the next room low to the ground, which the game has taught the player not to do. Room 10 does not absolutely punish the player for entering low, but it compounds the challenge from Room 9 by lifting the glider into an obstacle if the player reacts too slowly. The room also asks the player to use the core lessons already learned to move through the obstacles. It's an instance where the player is no longer being taught anything, but asked to use the skills learned. The glider needs to enter room 11 high in order to reach the thermostat and turn on the floor vents. The thermostat does not appear again in Glider 3+, so it works as a new reason for players to use a skill that the player already learned, entering the room high. Room 12 is the devil. If the glider wasn't forced into the electrical outlet in Room 6, the player will definitely learn how it works here. Not only must the glider navigate under and over tables while using lift from the candle, it has to sip lift off the edge of the central floor vent in order to avoid the paper copters. The shelf at the top here is really interesting. It's one of the few objects in Glider 3 Plus that doesn't threaten the glider as an obstacle, but it creates a sense of anxiety by lowering the ceiling of the room and, as well, turning a known safe area, the top of an air vent, into a perceived threat. The air vent won't actually push the glider into the top shelf, but the shelf affects the player emotionally, which is a super interesting design choice. Let's see if I can make it through this time. Very good. Room 13 gives players a new reward for using known skills, in particular gauging how far the glider will travel forward from a given height. By giving the player an air vent near the start of the room, the game gives the player a known safe spot. Flying too high will send the glider into the top shelf with a clock, so the safe spot isn't 100% reliable. If the glider keeps moving forward after hitting the light switch, though, it will crash into the lower table. The game expects the player to return to the first air vent as a secure place after taking a risk by flying toward the switch in the dark. Much like the high shelf in Room 12, this design affects the player emotionally. It requires the player to balance security and risk while also making the safe spot slightly unreliable, so the player has to decide when and how to trust the one piece of security that the level design provides. Room 14 forces the player to use their downward navigation skills with new precision. The player wants to start high up for the most room to move the glider past the leak, and a receiving vent awaits to discourage the player from asking for too much security. In a rare hiccup, this vent transports the glider to a room without a return vent. I'm going to just fast forward back to Room 14. Now let's do this room right. There we go. Room 15 is the final room, and it poses an entirely new challenge: the bad cat. The cat is both a static and dynamic obstacle, and the glider has to fake out the cat in order to pass through the window. And here is the freedom that gives the narrative its oomph. Players can choose a different style of paper airplane called a dart, a more familiar style of paper airplane. The dart moves forward very quickly, but it moves backwards slowly. Its forward speed can simplify some rooms, but the slow reverse speed can make a handful of rooms extra challenging. Rather than play through the entire game again as the dart, I'll highlight moments that illustrate its differences. Getting this clock, for example, requires a fine touch. Threading the needle to get an extra life shows the danger of overcommitting with the dart, since it can't back out of a bad situation easily. Its forward speed can also make riding the edge of an updraft easy to bungle. Here, I played too conservatively and crossed the copter's path. Interestingly, the dart can move through the thermostat room without hitting the thermostat, but the game actually punishes this. If the dart misses the thermostat, the air vents in the following room will be turned off as well. The dart can hit the light switch without running into the table below, but this costs the player the opportunity to get the clock for a bonus. And the bad cat in the final room is often more challenging with the dart because a careless player can overcommit and find themselves unable to back out of the cat's swat. And that wraps up our detailed look at Shareware Glider 3+. The game is short and focused, and that density helped it circulate to become an early Mac favorite. It generates a lot of challenge out of simple controls and movement that are intuitive to understand. It's a fantastic example of the games of its time. In the next video, I'll look at Glider's commercial debut with Glider 4.0. Thank you for watching.